Now, many of you know that for the last 7 or so years I've been asking my guests to give me a biography of themselves in 7 words that might or might not define them. Anne Hamilton submitted these 7 words to me: hands in motion, reading, feeling, touching, finding. Susan Meiselas wrote these 7 words for me and said, "What do you think of this? I'm not good with words." Now, I thought that would be great 7 words, but she added. She said, "So what do you think of this? I'm not good with words." And you can imagine that that made me worried for tonight. But I think she's extremely good with words. And her 7 words are: always moving with eyes, listening to engage. Now, after the conversation, they will sign books. And before they sign books, they will take a few good questions. Please welcome them.
Here we are.
Well, it's especially nice to have old friends for both of us and a lot of strangers.
And here we are. Okay.
Here we are.
And I think we should say that we didn't have the conversation in advance.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
No, that was the whole idea.
Mm-hmm.
So I first saw Anne's work, and I just realized it was 25 years ago. In Dia. And I kept thinking, when Paul asked me why Anne, I said, because I walked into a room, 5,000 square feet, filled with horsetail hair, bundled, and a little desk. I didn't know if it was you, just a lone figure, reading and burning lines. I had no... I mean, I was just so a million miles away from the place that you created. And I've never forgotten it. And so we've lived a lot of life in 25 years.
Well,
so that's kind of why Anne.
And I think it would be like fair to say that it's completely reciprocal in the sense of like why and how images haunt. Right? That they do things that words don't do. But we need both, right?
Yeah.
And so, and in fact, we had met and promised, we had met, I think, at one of the convenings that we were both at, and promised to have a conversation that I think maybe we're now having.
It's taken a long time.
It's taken a long time.
Yeah.
But
well, time. It's a lot about time.
And materiality. So we just shared the most extraordinary tour, as Paul referenced, looking at some of the books and photographs that were in the collection, and I was really. What is it that when you experience the physical materiality of these things that have evidence of the body, they have evidence of a human hand touching them, using them, that we are struck, we are touched, we are changed by that record or that imprint. And even before we get to images, it made me think a lot about one aspect of your work, or the many aspects, is that you've worked in so many different forms, whether it's published in a magazine or in a book or on a wall the size of a mural. But as I look across your practice, I think one of the things that really connects us is the importance and the specificity of its materiality. And that it matters in each context or condition what you can do, how you can work with that, that it has everything to do with how we actually end up experiencing the images. And each situation offers you maybe an opportunity for you to address those images a little bit differently.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's
Yeah,
kind
and
of a
to
question,
shift.
actually, Susan.
And shifting. That was a question. Well, just as a
How do
free
you think about
association
that? Yeah.
to my being in the same space with you just now, I was thinking of the anonymity of all of that beautiful work that we were experiencing
Yeah.
versus the world we live in, which is all about authoring and the identity expressed in the work or not, you know, and just what's been left behind, the remains. And Paul, when you quoted about writers, I was thinking about that. That's actually true for photographers. So in Magnum, when we lose a photographer, we honor them with the photographs that we remember of theirs.
Yeah.
And there's always a sequence contributed by whomever wants to remember. And so why we're remembered by what we make and attached in the way we are to what we make is kind of the traces of who we thought we were or are in responding to the lives that we're living in the world that we're part of, which happens to be, we're so contextualized by the times that we're living. So, you know, it's particularly strange to show this work because so much is happening right now. One of the things that Anne and I thought we would do is, not knowing who knew what they knew, in a way, we thought we would just give a little really short kind of lift points or some reference points that would also help us to maybe, and you reference this maybe, if you want, I'll answer the question. What do you think? Or do you want to talk
Would you like to see images?
See, because it's funny about images. I'm going to start with the one to say that because I wasn't seeing images in 1978, I went to Nicaragua. And I think that's really important to say in relation to what we're talking about, because we now see so much. We're so oversaturated, we don't remember even where things come from.
Right.
Or maybe even have the urgency to go somewhere to know something.
Because you can't see it, so you don't know that it's happening, right? Which is what got you there.
That's why I went, but I don't know now what motivates people to go places. It's a different, it may feel very different to grow up with the internet where everything is so accessible. So what I'm saying is 1978, there were stories about a place that I didn't have any idea of what it looked like. So we're not going to go through a lot of photographs, but I wanted to bring up something that Anne, I think, and I will dance back and forth, because we, in our preview, I kept thinking, Anne, I wanted to understand how Anne responds to space and the emptiness of space. And I wanted to sort of talk about how I find myself in both a reactive mind and body and a responsive bond in and where the responsiveness comes from for both of us, maybe.
And I think that maybe, like, to respond to that is that when we were preparing for this, we were thinking about, well, how do you talk not necessarily about what you've made, but what are the conditions that have allowed you to stand there? Like when I read about you getting on a plane and just going, not speaking the language, knowing that something was happening, but it wasn't evident, right? And even at first you couldn't see it. And so what is it, what is that kind of internal preparation, or what is that kind of intuition, sixth sense, whatever we call it, that propelled you to go and then to stay? It's like it's in the air, but it's not material yet. And how do you account for that? I think we all have it in different ways, but as you look back at the places, like, why did I stay? Or I knew I needed to go here on a Tuesday, and this thing then unfolded in front of me. And how do you, prepare the ground to listen for that?
Listening.
Listening. Yeah.
It's the listening. I've said it's also a dwelling place. So the going the staying, the returning, the dwelling to return or not to return, in a way. That's, I think, what motivates this little sequence. So maybe
we should.
I'm gonna see if we can, because when you talk about photographs that first live in a magazine, that's very temporal and very immediate and very response in a very timely way.
Right.
A book shifts time just by bringing them together, and the sense of a necessity for a home to be together, right? But the thing that really shifted for me was having one of those images that has become known as the Molotov Man, who I discover in time moving on beyond the frame that I make. And that, I think, is how an idea comes from the point of engagement, not from doing a job in any sense. It's a response to a condition that's shifting.
Right.
And it has a life that's outside of my frame, which is, again, when we talk about how audiences...
And it's the condition of this image shifting.
And
right?
this image
and
then
the
shifting. And then creating
it.
new places for this image. So this image made on the day Somoza left the country in '79 becomes a symbol of No Pasaran, that when the Contra War begins, he becomes a symbol. And so when he moves from being a symbol, 10 years later, I go back to meet the man. But it takes 10 years to go back to meet the man, to find the man, to know that there's a man behind the symbol. Right. And try to understand.
And who initially didn't have a name, right?
Who didn't have a name.
Yeah.
He was the Molotov Man. So Pablo Beretta becomes a figure, and what's interesting then, beyond the frame of his own life, plays a role in this revolutionary life. So I think I'm supposed to hit this. Whoops, I may have just... So this is now a 25-year, a 10-year mark, then a 25-year mark. I think we...
So it was 10 years after you took the image that you...
Went back to meet him.
Right.
And then 25 years later, I bring back these murals because I want to see if they have any meaning in the society that's lived for 25 years, not in a state of war.
Yeah.
And who is he to these young boys? Who is he to the neighbors who were there when he fought at that time? And this was on the 25th anniversary. So a film that first began with this idea of pictures from revolution, where are the people in these photographs, how have their lives moved beyond the frame of a photograph, leads to a filmic reality. And then, but the thing that I wanted to show just about this sequence is 5 years later, when I go back to find Beretta and see how he's doing, in his hometown, he's been monumentalized, right? But even one step beyond that, and we are now, I'm going to show I bring back all of that little stepping stones, the black and white contact sheet where I miss the frame, the color frames that are around it, this whole thing of the incidental, accidental moment of a photograph, as intentional as you might be, as intuitive as you might be, it's still, and it is different than the imagination, which is why we have to go back to you. These are just steps in the transformation of the Molotov Man, to have a life of an image that's beyond anything I could imagine taking at the moment I'm making it. So that's what I want to get us to, is sort of that I don't have the imagination in the moment that I'm making and responding to where it's going to go. And I just will end with this one, because this came to me 2 weeks ago from a friend's Facebook page, because for any of you who know, Nicaragua has been, the Nicaraguans have been again in the streets, and and the Facebook is the way in which it's being expressed
and circulating. Yeah.
But go back to the imagination, because we both have a kind of connection through the idea of place, where work begins. And I think I'm very aware that this was a very specific time and a very specific place.
Well, and I have a question about that, Susan, because it's like the way this photograph became a symbol. and then took on many, many other lives, was used by other people, appeared in different kinds of publications. It started to almost build its own archive, right?
Exactly.
It built its own history.
Yeah.
And then how did that, watching and experiencing that happen, how did that influence you going back? You know, was that, because it's an act of really, like this act of return is also a gift, right? That it's like this, like there's something at the core of this which is about sharing. And the necessity of sharing and finding a form to do that with this image that has had an incredibly public life.
Yeah.
And
but there are different levels of sharing, because there's the sharing with
it's appropriate, some
community,
appropriated. Yes.
And the first 10 years, it's the community that re-experiences that image in that neighborhood where that image was made. When I took it back, but when you think about Beretta living inside that image, it's a very private space, and I'm not sure I've ever really...
Did he talk about that?
He talks about it, but in a way
like that it's a...
He's so inside that image as a symbol of a revolution. What I really need to do if I'm going to go back now is not to just be in the streets, but to know where Beretta is now when he sees this image circulating. Right? Where is he in relation to his past, his understanding of his gesture, in relation to what is another kind of insurrectional moment in this country, which he may or may not be part of.
Right, right. Which is
so I don't think images, though we look at them as fixed in a moment in time, they actually, I'm interested in them over time. And that's... So when I will go back, I don't know, but that's what I'll be thinking about.
Well, and you're going to show the Kurdistan project, right?
No, I think you're going to show us something.
Oh, okay.
Please.
Maybe should we just go to that?
No.
Because it's so connected.
Don't you agree?
Okay. I mean, this is like...
Please.
Like, okay.
This is an interrupted conversation.
How does this work? There we go. So back to New York City. And I think, you know, as Susan and I were talking about how you're responding to historical context, that the making of work is also part of, I think, a making of history. And that where you place yourself, that how much the work responds is a response to being there, right? You don't go with some preconceived idea of some image you're going to make or find or whatever. And so I would say that the analogy in some ways is that I also start kind of blank. It's like trying to arrive. I don't fly there without an invitation, but I was asked, I mean, that's a big thing. I'm invited to respond. And so this, as many of you know in the room, is at Park Avenue Armory. And I remember walking in this tremendous volume, and there's a way that you feel your own volume inside its embrace of that volume and thinking, I hope they asked me to do something. I so hope they asked me to do something. I love this space. But it's like to also think about that it's an empty space the size of a city block in New York City and how extraordinary that is. And how might my research there, my experience of that space be part of, let's see if we can, there we go. Maybe we can turn the sound out just a little bit and I'll talk over it, but how can it be, how can a civic space, what is a civic space now? How do we come together? What are the possibilities of coming together? And I think that's a thread that really connects our work. And not over-determine it, not over-script it. But this project at the Park Avenue Armory really started out with the conversation with the curator, Christy Edmonds, saying, I want to read to New York City, and being very interested in the intimacy of sitting physically elbow to elbow with someone and someone reading out loud, and how can that become something that is shared in a civic space? And this is the response to, in some ways, that question. And the question doesn't explain what formed from it, but I think it's how I stand there, in the way that, it's like the questions you ask when you go somewhere over time have evolved the forms, the many forms of your work. I mean, here I was, my form is given to me by the architecture. So the trusses are just asking for a swing. But the system was really important because you were suspended from the space, and together you suspended the cloth between you. And that cloth between you raised and lowered in response and moved its turbulence in response to your presence. And so the live presence of standing in that, walking a space into my body, that it comes from an embodied present, an embodied experience. And then, the attempt of the work, I use the word sharing, asking you about the taking back of images or returning them to the place where they were taken, is that it's like, how do you, for me, one of the questions is, well, how do you invite someone into this experience? Not to say, I want a specific thing to happen, but can it include you, to find your own thing within it? And just as, images have so many there's so many narratives. So this became like a park, really. But it also, I think at the end it shows you maybe it as a nod to the library, which is my very favorite Friday night thing to do, is be in the library, is that this field of motion was bracketed by two readers reading to a flock of pigeons at one's end, and a writer writing letters to the qualities of air and space and time at the other end. And they were airmail letters that have yet to be mailed. But just as a nod to partly library. So these are the pigeons. And the reading were a series of texts that were structured as concordant scrolls. And so the act of reading is actually an act of composition between the two readers. Let's see, I worked with City Company, a theater collaborative ensemble here in New York, and they and their students were the readers, except for this very tall man in the images from Sweden, and he has an amazing voice. But they were reading across, you can see the sequence of, this is a pigeon that got out one day. But it came back, it wanted to be read to, right? But the concordance, so it has a spine of words that comes from a text, and the occurrence of that word in a book. We started out with Aristotle's De Anima, which talks about the fact that the touch is the sense common to all species. And maybe sound and reading, hearing another person's voice is how we touch at a distance. So here the reading is improvised across that structure. And so it was a way that, like, the essence of the writing comes forward, but not the actual narrative of it. And it's held then between the two people reading to each other, to the pigeons, and to the shortwave radio that were being carried around in paper bags in people's hands. And so it's partly, how do we bridge or make intimacy through these material things? And that's where I think a lot about, the materiality in your work, especially, as things came back into books or...
Yeah, but I'm remembering swinging. What a gift. I mean, to everyone who entered that space, it was just extraordinary. I mean, anyone could be there for as long as they wanted to be there. It was, I just couldn't even imagine how you could walk into that empty space and create that world for us. It was just extraordinary.
I can remember, Jamie's here from the Armory. I can remember the first time we hung a test swing in the space, because 80 feet, you're very low on the pendulum. And so what happens, I think, is when you get on, it takes your weight. It's nothing like a park where you go like this. It takes your weight. And it's more like a magic carpet. And so it takes your weight. And I think what happens is your heart falls open.
Yeah.
You know, like...
well, it's this unexpected... I'm drawn to the unpredictable, and you're creating the unexpected. There's something different about those things, but...
And to place you back in your own body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember being there and people not knowing if they could, and there was nobody to ask.
Right.
And that's so much because of the other kinds of spaces. You're talking about creating a public space.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what to do in Bryant Park. They take it over.
Yeah.
But that's not always what happens in the Armory.
Right.
And so you change the conditions fundamentally of our relationship to that space in that particular piece, you know?
Well,
and that's kind of where it goes back to that dwelling of remembering what it felt like to walk across horsehair and not know where I was. You create a space of uncertainty, which then suddenly opens up something that you let go of what you're expecting to see or do, which is quite different than the way photographs work. So that's
because it's like in some ways it's like that the sensations of that, whether it's walking across the hair or that it unsettles you in a way that also distracts you from trying to figure out what something means.
Exactly. So but you see, I think I'm more the means. Yeah, what's meaning? Well, I am more stuck in narrative. Versus the abstraction and the more poetic. I get very contextual and feel that I need layers to be stripped away and or dig deeper in some sense. I'm not satisfied by just the one, let's say, image. It's always wanting to be layered. Yeah.
Which is
this is
perfect
where
point to go to this.
Yeah, this is sort of going to a different place that... This is the difference between, in the sense of Nicaragua, hearing about, or reading about a place. In this case, I'm hearing about a place, and this is Kurdistan in '91, just after the Gulf War. And I'm reading, hearing testimonies of refugees who fled into Turkey and Iran about the Anfal campaign, which was the killing of the Kurds. So this is one of the first videos I do, which barely has survived time, just of the scale of the rubble and destruction, 4,000 villages. Of course, I'm not documenting all of them, and trying to make sense of, so where do you begin? So this is, again, it's unimaginable. I go in order to know, because the refugees have fled with their stories, but no one's seen what they fled from. And I think to move quickly just through this is a sequence so we keep a conversation floating. When I go back and document the mass graves, it's very meticulous work. The landmarks of the stones that mark what has happened that nobody dare disturb. It's honored ground until the forensics.
This is later.
This is one. This is the same time frame.
This is the same time period.
But I begin to find the places to work. And of course, this is broken out of a sequence because I'm trying to say that that's a beginning point. So I think I'm going to do one thing. Right. This is where I want us to interconnect, because when you walk into that space, don't know if you do know what you're going to do. Sometimes you have to make a proposition before they let you do anything, right? That's
I try to avoid that.
That's right. But they don't say, here it is, Anne, do whatever you want, but you have to convince
them to say that.
But you have to convince them. I mean, somebody must say, Anne, here's this invitation, but then we got to make sure you can really do this, right? I don't have quite that, and we'll come back to that, because I think once I get I'm moving, I'm not asking anyone for permission.
You're just there.
I'm just trying to figure out and how to navigate.
How do I begin? You're like, how do I begin to respond to this? Right?
Yeah.
This is like, and what form does that even take? And how do I even place myself here?
How do I place?
How do
Who
you
am I
place
to
it?
be here? Which is a whole nother.
Right.
Who am I to be in this place at this time?
And in this context, and in this first visit, you were there. Did you have any other agency? Was there?
I
was with you?
attempted to meet the Human Rights Watch team that was taking testimonies.
Yeah.
And that's a longer story. In fact, soon after this photograph's made, I go back again with Clyde Snow, who's a forensic anthropologist, and we exhume this grave.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I did not exhume
And
it,
you
but
have
I
photographs
document
of
the
that,
exhumations.
yeah.
What happens in that next stage is, again, this slight shift point in which the women who surround the graves are carrying the images of those people who have disappeared,
Right.
and they don't know if they're living or dead.
And the thing that when I remember seeing this image is so really gives me chills about this is that it's like it's also it's on the clothing, it's worn, it's close to a warm body. It's like that the memory is kept alive. It's like a refusal of erasure.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And,
exactly.
Yeah.
And there have been many iterations of this before. This is made in 91, 92, but of course I've seen the Plaza de Mayo, the women who carried
Right.
in Argentina, in Buenos
Right, they
Aires, in
disappeared.
Guatemala, and this idea of holding an image, placing an image in people's homes of someone who's passed. All of this is a history from Latin America as much as
Right.
where I'm landing. I think the shift point for me is to wonder, how could I possibly give presence to the absence of this people who've been decimated, their
Right.
culture's been decimated.
Right.
And that's the shift point for me as a photographer, to not make photographs, but then find the photographs that might tell this story. So this goes back to narrativity and
When
artifacts kind of being
And you
embedded.
described that like so beautifully. You said, can I quote you to yourself? I had to do a little homework, right? No, because you
That
said,
was off limits.
I am the needle threading through the stories.
Oh, that's beautiful
And,
for you. And and
yeah.
the title of your piece is
Is
a thread. What piece you just showed us?
what's the name of it? The event of a thread. Sorry, I was having a blank there for a second.
Wow.
Yeah, because so
Wow.
the
Wow.
thing
Yes.
about the thread, which is my first hand too, is that it, like you start on the surface and it's what you can see, and it dips down through the cloth to this infinite space that you can't see. Right? And it's to bring up from underneath that invisibility to something you can experience. And so when I think about your whole practice, to me, it's embodied in that gesture, even though you're not literally sewing, right? But
Well,
when you move to the archive work,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which comes from this project, then you're in a very different place. You're not a photographer in the same sense, or you're not coming from a documentary or a photojournalist sort of, I'm here with my camera, but it's like, maybe I'm projecting too much, but it's like that the question of maybe what is needed here, what's the way of bringing this thing
What's needed
forward
here,
to shareable experience
So it's
needs
interesting
another form.
the idea of the gesture. Actually, it's something else also about the kind of stitch, which, I recognize this is
Right.
going to be a basting stitch.
Yeah, it's a running stitch.
It's a running
stitch. Yeah.
Which is really, a painful acknowledgement. So much is missing. I'm just trying to give some sort of a path through history.
And for things to attach themselves to that, right?
Yeah.
And is that
Yeah.
in part why also that it's been really important for the Kurdistan book to have it has the online
Well, that's,
part
you
of
know,
that. Can you talk about that? Finding
we
you
were
know, these
gonna,
multiple forms?
you know, the book
Here.
becomes this fixed thing, which is, you know,
Fixed
you make exhibitions, installations, and then books of the installations. They're always different than the experience of the place and the space and the time.
It's its own experience.
And
yeah.
Books are, this was about almost 7 years of work bringing together the bits and pieces in the stitching times, at times tighter and looser, but as soon as it existed, it was inadequate to time moving on. So it goes back to
And so but your response to that
having
was
to
like
re-engage with the community beyond the family album of a book, bring the artifacts of the photographs back into a space where people could experience them differently than a book, which is very private, even if it's shared. And a space allows them to live. I mean, my assistant at that time, every time we would open the crates, and it's kind of like the feeling we just had that I know the curators who shared these little gems felt. It's like they get to wear their party dresses and be out and be celebrated. And then they get boxed up again into their little boxes and, you know, filed away and buried very often. And so I wanted those artifacts to have as long a life as they could outside of the book. And then it so happened that that was the transitional point, and the idea was, can you then move to the internet in which it could be a continuous participatory process?
Right.
And so space, time, and geography were the entry points, the access points for a community to continue to contribute.
But I think that's another example of where you're also trying to give it away. Right, you're not necessarily. You're not giving it away.
Well, no, no. But I mean, I think this must be this is where I wonder for you, because you're creating this gift for us in a public space. You're giving it to us. It's for us. It's yours, but it's given to us. And I think that. This collecting of the history was for them more than for me.
Right.
And the awkwardness even of a book having my name on it, which is completely inappropriate because it's not my history. But it's a collecting process and a collective collection, essentially. But this, when the internet opens up, and this is 98, so it's very primitive, and actually Sue Johnson, who designed this with me, is here, which is very nice, special. This then is the most recent rendering, and the reason I want to show you that
Where is it?
This just came down from the Jeu de Paume in Paris. So these little storybooks, which were uploaded, stories that were uploaded into the internet, until the internet could no longer function without upgrading. The internet, you know, this is an internet from 20 years ago. This was designed 20 years ago. It's hard to believe, but it's 20 years ago.
Right.
So the more recent is a reflection on the fact that the homeland of Kurdistan, which is still in dispute, and without getting into all the tensions of Turkey, when this show traveled, I painted a borderless map of their migration. So these are stories that come from the area where people are born or migrate with them to wherever they now are. So another expression that feels, and I don't have well, you can sort of see the guy reading there. So this goes back to the public responding. So you're creating spaces, and when, I guess for me, just recently being at Jeu de Paume, I had no idea if people would take the time
to read,
to feel that it was for them to touch. And touching in museums is so often forbidden.
I know.
I mean, there are gates around things and lines around things, and
and
I love it.
And you're inviting that in. And
and the fact that the books, some of them even fell apart, was kind of great. You know, so how do you signal we want a different kind of relationship in the spaces that we attempt to articulate and
like for you, relative to this, because this is like a project. When I think about these projects, they'll never be done.
No,
Right?
exactly.
Like that
Yeah.
each of the kind of threads of work, in some ways, they could go on and on and on, and the relationships return. They're made in these relationships, and so, is there a point where you're like, I have to say goodbye, or like, how do you carry that
Well,
around?
I was going to ask you that question.
Oh.
I mean, well, because
Yeah,
you can't do the project in the armory anywhere else. It was site specific. It's a response to, as you say, that architecture.
Yeah, and to all, and I think this is another thread that really connects us, is like and to all the hundreds of conversations with, not just the people who came, but way before that, like the readers and the writers and the theater director Anne Bogart who helped, and the curator, and it's just like that. Every conversation is helping form it, because it's that same. It's like really an act of finding. You don't know what you're making. You don't know how it needs to be, and in the process, you're trying to make it open enough that you can find what something needs to be to form. At the same time, it needs to stay really open until it's ready to settle, into something. And so, I think one of the things that was very unique for me to the Armory is that it fell between my teaching calendar, and so I could stay and I could be there every day. And I was pretty exhausted at the end of it, but I was very exhausted. But it'd be like that I had to be there because I had to feel it. I had to experience that every day it was actually different, that it's not the same, even though it's the same. And that I knew I couldn't learn from it unless I could really stay and make that relationship to it, because it's really in that I learn what it even is. It isn't that I even know when it opens. And so I think that sense of finding, or like trying to make the spaciousness around you to like not have the pressure of like, I have to send these photographs off to whomever or for whatever, but like to structure a project so that it can find, in some ways, so it can find itself.
Yeah,
And
I think I'm actually having to function almost in a duality. One part
you
of
have to
me
do
is letting
both,
go,
right?
and one part of me is keeping it within and hoping that it'll reappear, and I'll have another understanding of what it is or was. So you're not repeating the form, but you're moving your own body through what the making into something else you make under other conditions. But it's all of it's through you.
Forward.
And I guess the one, in a way, somehow I am, in that sense, responding to something exterior. So the collaborative nature is, there are situations where obviously the collective work in Kurdistan is very collaborative. I'm going from, backyard to backyard.
Well, and can you describe, just for those that aren't familiar, like what you were doing with developing the pictures and giving them to people?
Well,
and I think that's such an important exchange, that the acts of exchange that make this work.
Well, this is,
to me,
this is always, I
there.
wish I could recreate Polaroid for us all. I mean,
maybe
Polaroid
someone in the room could work on that.
It was just such an extraordinary process, because you have a positive that you give. You can give away or you can keep.
Right.
And the negative, in this case.
So you keep the negatives here and you give the positives?
And one step before that is I'm making a reproduction of an original. So the original never leaves its home, fundamentally, which was really important. I wasn't taking anything away. I was trying to
record.
They were sharing what they had.
Yeah.
But that wasn't taking anything away. That's a complicated thing. Here we are in the library, and we just enjoyed somebody took something away. There was a lot of taking away or giving at the end of lives. We saw some artifacts that were given at the end of life. So that's an interesting question, how that changes. But
can we go? But some like, so my understanding, you know, I've never been to this. I've never been here, but it's like that. It also, to possess some of these photographs would also make the family or the person having the photograph incredibly vulnerable, right?
Could have been at risk.
Could have been at
under
risk, right?
certain regimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if that's... I think what's interesting now is it's more a question of what is this archive, which isn't really an archive, it's a collection.
I mean, I met someone last year in Austin, who was a graduate student there, who's Kurdish, and he talked to me about your book and how incredibly important this book is for him, for his family, for his cultural memory, and the gift of that. So, like, where does all this material reside now? That's
the big question.
Right?
That's the big question. I mean, you can't be in that little room wondering how much time do we all have without where does it all go and belong. So there it is in a country that's still in turmoil in different ways. The whole region is in turmoil. So where would it be most safe and where would it belong? Should it be in the New York Public Library because I'm a New Yorker?
But it's,
you know, can I
like
wait the rest of my life for Kurdistan to settle and be ready to receive it? You know, these questions of whatever we've gathered and contributed are part of us and very much from the places we've been. So finding the balance of where things belong and should rest, sort of that endless question.
Really complicated because it's such a responsibility, right? So to be responsible to taking care of that, that's what the library, I'm looking at Paul, does. But it's like to take on the responsibility of that, and it's like, but that responsibility has, it seems to me, a lot to do with then how you decide to work or how you decide to give things form in the work.
Well, that may be partly why multiple forms
are necessary
with the work.
Yeah.
You know, bringing images back into a landscape is one kind of way of working with memory and community. A physical object that people can have in their homes, even in some cases at risk, in a place like Turkey. To have that book is risky. You would not put it on your dining room table, in living room table. You would not. You would hide it if you dared to have it. But I think I don't know why. I was just thinking about who they're different kinds of givings. I mean, I'm as moved that somebody, I don't know if the person holding the little book in the exhibition space is connecting for the first time to someone they don't know, to a place they will never go. And is it as important for them? When we did this workshop, and I did it with Alex, who's my assistant in here, a week before the Jeu de Paume show opened, we did a workshop with Kurds who had recently, and some had settled some time ago from in France. And so there were 10 new books that came from the people who were living there then, to be put on the wall. And they were brought to the wall. And so they came into a room. It's kind of like that empty room. My experience of your empty room, which would terrify me, the armory, was a room where we had an open invitation. If anybody wanted to come to tell a story, they could. And they sat around a table for about a day, not knowing if they had any stories to tell. And asked, well, what is a story? And so, you know, this question, what story do I have to tell? How would I tell it? And then there were a group of listeners and a group of tellers. And we broke into little groups. And together they found a photograph and began to talk around the photographs.
And so the photograph was the
kicker, the trigger.
Triggered it,
That then began some telling. And then they were stitched into stories and made into little books.
And then those added to the project.
Those books were added to the wall.
Yeah.
So
So
I had no idea if anyone would come into the room.
Yeah.
You knew that somebody was going to come into the armory.
But we had no idea if anyone would get on a swing. Or like, do you think they'll get on? But it's like, but it's also so within this, you've made a context for people to enter, right?
Yeah.
You've made an invitation.
Yes,
right?
But none of those people had ever been in a museum
at all
in Paris.
Yeah.
They lived in and around Paris, and they had many different kinds of backgrounds from the region. But the museum was not a place they felt they belonged. So one of the most beautiful parts, really, of this was when they came to find their books on the wall.
And sit in the museum.
Felt they could be
honored.
There. Yeah.
To feel honored, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these spaces that are, we're in one now. Institutional.
Authority.
When we all went into the reading room, we had this wonderful feeling of welcome.
Yeah.
People quietly doing whatever they're doing with great intensity.
And sharing.
Sharing.
It's this, like, and when something touches you, your first impulse is to share it, right? To say, oh, look at this.
Not to everyone. I mean, there are also people who don't want you to know want you to know what they have. In Kurdistan, there were definitely people who didn't offer photographs, and then they saw the book and said, "Oh, but you left my photograph out." I think, yeah, but you didn't offer it.
There's something in the essay about like, oh, but I'm the historian, and it's like my story's not in here, right?
Yeah.
And
I don't want other people to know that I have something very precious.
It's being held because
it's held from the community, engaged. Because
I suppose
process.
It's also when you share it, you also, in some ways, that can be very vulnerable, right? The telling of your story or making something public.
Well, that was actually the central question when people came into that room and they said, "Well, how do we think about a story?" And I said, "Well, what would you like your son to know, or your son to be, if to be born?" That you haven't yet told him, that you also feel you could tell to a stranger. So that's that was open enough to begin a process.
And then Susan, relative to that, so that's inviting from a really specific culture and a really specific history that hasn't had a country, hasn't had an archive. And then how do you think about like our role, or my role, right? Like I don't know, but I think the artifact quality of the images that are for me in the book, there's a my hand recognizes them even if I can't touch them. And so there's an empathy that I find in your work that crosses my particular cultural circumstances, and that is a large project of the work. It's incredible. It's very radical to try to make that space that we can enter. And that's I can only think of it that it's a consequence of how you place yourself there.
Well, this goes back to the body.
How do you get trust, and how that over time, not everybody, but you are...
the being there is a key thing.
The staying,
but this is,
right?
I would imagine, when you're thinking about a space, can you begin to think about it before you're in it, before you go to it?
No, it's really, really hard. And the worst projects they've ever made is because I didn't have enough time for them to sit in my body to understand, what questions it was asking, or what, I feel like it's so much like there's something here and I can feel it, but I don't know what it is. And it's like about trying to, excavate that, trying to bring it up to the surface to be something that you can see and touch, and it can be shareable. It's not narrative. It's about a felt quality. But I think, if information changed the world, we wouldn't be where we are. And so as much as that insistence on needing wanting to understand all the specificity of cultural context, on the other hand, I don't know that all that information always is kind of maybe what motivates us sometimes to act or to inhabit our own agency or whatever vocabulary you want to use. That it's like how do we actually allow ourselves to feel? You know, how do we allow ourselves to feel, to bridge the space to another person? Is actually to actually see another person standing in front of us and not just like take. Right.
And sometimes, you know, the photographic process gives you the illusion of that closeness, but you're still not necessarily bridging the distance. Even, you know, from the image to the book to the exhibit. I mean, you're always wondering
that that always feels incomplete, or that always feels inadequate,
always feels inadequate. I think
it's just
it's a gesture towards the idea of the possibility
of connection.
Of the connection, maybe of the empathy, not only empathy though, just some sense of connectedness.
Like recognition, would that be a word? Like a sense of...
I don't know if it's recognition in the other... No, I think it's something about... It's interesting, the question of when you create a space where people experience themselves with others differently, which is what you did, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone, you said it was like a playground, but in fact,
it was like
everyone felt they could play. So it wasn't for children. Whereas when we go to playgrounds, it's for them. It's not for us. You created a way for us to be childlike, which was recovering a part of ourselves that we bury also, you know.
Or to just be really responsive, you know. I think without all the filters of like... I think we're so up here in our bodies, like so, what is this? What does it mean? And, you know, like trying to figure out why is this here? And I think, but, you know, like when you're walking down the street, you're just letting the street come in. And so there was enough scale that it could feel like that. But I think it's also about like we want to be full of attention, but not the self-consciousness that kind of paralyzes us. You know, and I think that what happens when you work with a lot of other people, and I can imagine, or I imagine relative to your being, you know, in the, you know, very far-flung places and very small villages up in the mountains, that it's the minute there's a connection, like the world completely opens up. And so it's this question about, like, what are the forms for connecting? How do we bridge that? And maybe it's a book passing lap to lap. Maybe it's, you know, something on the screen increasingly, but it's still like all comes to connection, you know, like
but there are two parts to it, because one is, how do you feel, maybe the question for you would be, have you ever gone into a space, somebody's invited you to perform yourself, which is what I think. I know you also do, but I mean, not just the performative end, but the end. The performance that Anne Hamilton is asked to perform in a space, in a different city, in a different world than you might live, and you don't feel it. What
disaster.
I mean, can you say no?
I have a question.
Thank you very much. Well, wait a minute. Thank you very much, but I don't think I feel it in the armory. I think I missed it. I don't have it.
That's my biggest fear.
There's so much at risk in that moment.
I mean, my biggest fear is that I don't have any feeling. I only have ideas.
Yeah.
And if and that I know if then there's something that's kind of like I haven't gotten down or in or whatever. And so, you know, I think I was going to ask you what you're afraid of, actually. I have a whole notebook of questions, actually.
Yeah, well.
But it was partly because I think for me the fear is like that I will become reactive rather than responsive, that I will... that I will lose the ability to feel. And I think that, you know, as you know, I mean, we can all share that we're numbed by information, right, to some degree. And so how do we stay alive within it? It's like, it's partly by being in relation. And so what are the forms that allow us to be in relation? And so, you know, this is my standing outside your practice, but looking in at your practice and its many evidences, is that it's all about insisting on staying in relationship to what you've made, not just the people, but it's like to always be going back and saying, this isn't enough, or this still needs to have another life, or it could have a, and now I see it 10 years later, or in a different way. The world has changed, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
so
it's so true. I mean, I won't.
Should we
We
have
were
questions?
just
Maybe
we were just in this process
Yeah.
today. So Sam is somewhere in the background out there. We were just going back over some work I did in '91 about domestic violence and for a website, and I have no idea why we're making. You know, what's the point of another website? But it was really work that we were doing to try and make sense of work that I had done that wasn't done. And I don't know what to do with it.
Right.
So when where to go with what is and what still could be, and I'm definitely not committed.
You're looking at.
I'm trying to make sense of what was it at that time. So much has happened and not happened in relation to that.
What specific
work.
material were you?
This is
are
this
you
work
looking at?
about domestic violence. And
Okay.
But
yeah.
but what I was going to go back to the fear and your. So you said this wonderful thing, I have ideas and I don't know if I can feel. And you have to feel in order to be able to create whatever you're going to make in a particular place.
Yeah.
And you just sort of triggered a memory that I had when I did really the first body of work, which was Carnival Strippers. And I remember I had worked on 3 or 4 years of gathering all these sound tapes and hand transcription for hours and days and months, and made this book at the time, had an exhibition with sound, but the main thing was making this object and then thinking I would never feel ever again about anything as deeply as I felt about them. And that was terrifying. And
you
so,
would not
you know what
be able to like have.
I couldn't. The intensity of the feeling I felt for those women was so great. And again, without focusing on the inadequacy of whatever you render in a frame, in a sequence, in a book, in an exhibition, the sound, their voices, all of those things were attempts to capture and create the intensity for someone else that I had experienced in some ways.
Yeah.
But the strongest memory is this fear that I could, it's kind of like you'll never love again, you know, to be able to give yourself over. So it's this feeling that you have to prepare. It's like what farmers know, you know, waiting for the fallow field. You know, this is a very subtle process.
You have to wait. Waiting is so much part of it.
Right, and waiting to be ready to give yourself again.
And
that's.
How do you?
But you see, no one's saying, "Here, do you want the armory?" Nobody's waiting for me. I'm just waiting for myself, actually, or that's what it feels like. It's just waiting for me to feel. I'll get on a plane or I'll turn a corner and I'll find some place. But it's so. What happens when you don't feel? What do you do and how long do you feel you can wait? Which is always a hard question. Do you give yourself the time to not?
You can't will it, right? So, I mean, certainly there's projects I don't do, or, you know, I think sometimes it takes a really, really, really long time to, you have some inclination about something and it takes 10 years to even be able to understand, pick that cloth up and understand, you know, so it's like you going back and looking at this material and you know, looking at the material of domestic violence within this particular moment, right? In the discussions in the culture and sort of like how is this important? What do I do with this? I have this. I can imagine
what do you have? What can you contribute?
Yeah.
Where might it belong? Where might it live? How do you reactivate, reanimate, re-engage with it? All of that, all of that. But I mean, going back to the real fear, the fear is not that different than what you're saying. The fear that you won't feel.
That you won't feel.
That you
I mean, that's
will
the
be
fear for the
impatient.
culture, really, isn't it? It's like for all of us, you know, that you...
Yeah. But the world doesn't give you much time to...
well, because we're consuming at a very, like images and information, you know, at such a fast rate, all of us in different, you know, ways. But so to state the obvious, but it's like, so within that, like maybe it's a question really more personal about like relative to your you know, daily practice or just the rhythms like over a week or a year. Like how do you make space to be in some way solitary, like, or to be blank so that those things can well up from maybe unbidden, but that they can, they have a chance to well up while on the surface everything is so...
And it's some kind of, I think it's sort of a mixed...
What do you do? Like how do you...
Well...
What do you do, Susan?
I mean, I need those days as far away as I can find them.
Is it traveling though? Is it
some of it's
being
traveling gives me strange because it's a suspension. Because it's time in between time, maybe.
Right.
It's that feeling of, you know, I'm going somewhere and I have no idea where I'm landing or what it will be.
And you're just,
I very often have seen in my little notebooks that kind of, what am I, why? I have no idea. I'm finding the momentum to get into the place to move myself. I know that moving my body someplace becomes very essential, but I don't know what will happen. So I have to be ready to do that.
Yeah.
And there have been, you know, that doesn't mean I can, I think there are different kinds of, and I don't know how that plays out for you because you work, we're talking about space, but your work also is two-dimensional. You work in multiple kinds of forms. You know, we focused on my multiple platforms, but a lot of your choosing different kinds of materials, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, exploring yourself as a performer, not just the maker of space for others. Yeah. You know, we haven't talked about that. I'm completely not ever in front of the lens comfortably, and I love that you place yourself there and have other people look at you in a way that I'm frozen to do that. You know, I'm in. There's the photograph that opens this Shoe the Pump show is me as a double exposure.
And you're like almost
and
not
yeah,
there,
it's one of the first photographs I've made, and it's recovered from in this survey process.
Or it's the back of you in Nicaragua, right? It's like it's just you
like
from the back.
Backs
to your
are
hair.
good. Backs are good. Yeah, I like backs too.
Yeah.
But no, I think that the tension between the visible self and the actualized self and the invisible self that you're always recovering by creating the possibility of interaction, because it's the interaction that reveals that self too. You know,
it's in the exchange. But I also think, like, I think for me, putting myself forward is also like it's a way to be vulnerable. Like, so it's like if you can be exposed and you can be vulnerable, then you can do all sorts of other things. So I think it's partly about that vulnerability. You know, like being hidden but being seen.
Yeah.
And
maybe it's just the selfie culture has completely destroyed that feeling for me.
But
I can't relate to the necessity to self-eyes constantly. I don't know. But that's not what you're doing at all.
No, that's not at all. In fact, maybe can I just switch way ahead in this?
Sure.
To show let's see. This is
a library.
We're skipping. Okay, because I want to show this, because this is really the first time, in some ways, photography came into my work. And so it was really standing very consciously face to face with another person with a camera in my mouth. So it's actually about the contact here rather than behind here. And so, and, you know, it's not really very appealing to stand with your mouth open in front of a total stranger, but there's something about taking a very ordinary, like the assumption of a camera in a different way. So, you know, the orifice of...
So it's like the secret camera in your mouth. You open your mouth, it becomes the aperture. You close it, and somebody's been taken.
It's the shutter.
You've gotten them. You got them.
Except that it's long. It's like, you know, 20 seconds.
So you're leaving your mouth open for 20 seconds, and they finally figure out what's happening.
No, I ask. I say, like, Susan,
can I take a picture?
I have this project
with my mouth.
Yeah. But what was so interesting for me in this is like it's so absurd, like and the photographs are blurry, and you know, but it's also so it's actually about the condition of photography allowing me to stand in this intimacy with a total stranger and look into each other's eyes. And to people I didn't speak the same language, to people I never maybe ever saw again. And so it was about like how the condition, it's like the condition of the camera allows you to be there. It allows you to bear the weight of actually all these narratives and like be part of making history. And I think that, you know, I'm not doing anything so large as that, but I do think that it's like I'm always questioning what is the condition here and how do I inhabit it, or how do I occupy it in a way that might change its relationships.
I'm sure it did. You should show the photographs.
Oh, yeah, I think I have. I mean, are you ready, Emmett? Oh, and there's Jamie.
But that's the act of.
Okay, so I can just tell you that this is my son, Emmett. He was one of the first experiments who's sitting in the front row. And when he would say, well, it was so interesting because at the time I was opening my mouth and you put your hands up to your eyes. So my mouth was the eye and you were doing this, but you said, Mom, I hate it when you do these weird things. It's like, please. But yeah, so you can see the inside of my mouth, but I, you know, and I think so. But I think for every situation, it's like, what's the givens of the situation, and what are its possibilities, and that's a way of then placing yourself somewhere. So I have no idea what time it is. If this is a good moment for questions, or
Paul,
like
guide us.
Just it feels like maybe it's time for questions.
Sure.
And it's always time for questions. Let me see. I have. Oh, I haven't. Wait. Before your question, I have one more question.
Well, they can think about their questions.
Okay, just one more. Okay. In Paul's introduction, you referenced Susan Stewart, who's a writer friend who's very important to me. And you, in your different projects, have worked with writers. Sometimes they're assigned, or you're assigned to make photographs for what they're writing. Can you talk about your relation? Is that too complicated? Like, I know for me, like, I'm always seeking, I'm looking for my writer. I'm always like I know increasingly my own writing, which is modest, is important part of my understanding what I'm doing, trying to give it express it in this other way, you know, through words, and that a very specific vocabulary ends up emerging for different projects. Yeah. But I know that when I read, I'm always reading. I'm looking for my writer always, and that it's an incredibly important part of what I do.
Well,
and
you know, it's been so different over different decades because, working with a great writer in the field where you're experiencing it in one way and they in another, and together something gets made. It's the hard thing is that it's not always made together. In the case of, you know, writing.
Or you're not even necessarily in conversation, right? Or you are?
Well, they're different. I've had all the full range of experience from somebody being assigned, and it's a parallel experience. They write, I make images, and they're woven together, as it were, stitched, perhaps, you know, in a magazine. Like, you know, that's one kind of experience. A different one is editing. Words, which I do a lot of.
Yeah.
So I'm more a collector of words and an editor and a shaper of words that then I weave in and around the photographs, let's say, with Kurdistan, or from the oral histories of the strippers, or the...
But you do a lot of writing through the process. Yes, you make notes.
I make very sloppy notes. I never really... Yeah. In fact... I'll pull out my notes since you're going to look at your notes.
Here's my notes.
And then
there's like...
Anne said she brought a notebook of notes, and I said, oh, well, I just have little scribbles here. I mean, I make notes. I have lots of little pieces of paper. I can't figure out where they belong and how to put them all together. And I'm very often living little notes.
Do you want us to leave these, Paul? No.
They'll be... Yeah, they might. Maybe they should be part of the collection. They're the notes of the conversation we didn't have.
Well, you just make these notes so that you can actually sit up here, right? Because you know you're never going to get. I know I'm never going to get to them.
Okay, so nobody has a question.
Okay, so writers, any questions? Yeah. Or.
My questions.
Susan, you've made a lifelong commitment to Nicaragua and to going back over many decades. Now, with the recent upheaval and the turning against the original Sandinistas and the splitting apart of the Sandinista party, I'm curious as if you will go back and continue this cycle of photographs you've done.
So my dear friend Pam was just come back from Guatemala, who's made films about Guatemala for 35 years, something like that, back and forth. Of course, I have a Google alert, and I picked up X weeks ago the first kind of scratchy reporting of what was happening, and I was immediately in Skype conversations and trying to figure out, am I getting on a plane? In the old days, my bag would have been packed, as you know, and I wouldn't have hesitated, and I would be there. So now we're in a time where I'm seeing what they're seeing, and it all goes back to where do you place yourself in terms of a contribution? What would I do that they're not doing? The people who are there doing it, and I'm seeing what they're doing. So I think the question for me is not if, but when. And so I think in the time that the time of the momentous first decade, let's say, of the late 70s into the 80s, I was there as much and as often and as long as I could be, and it was a constant flow. And of course, what I'm reading and what I know to be happening is tremendously. It's potentially more tumultuous. But the question of what I contribute in that's kind of why I showed that Facebook page, because it's so revealing to me about how complex our relationships to time, to our own knowledge, what we give, what others take, where, I think I don't know the answer. I mean, Alex and Sam, who are here, know that I've been on the brink of maybe now, maybe yes, maybe no. Paul would have had a nervous breakdown because, when you go, and this is the important thing about going, and this goes back to being ready. To be ready to go means you have to be ready to stay. And so if you live a life where you make commitments to anyone else, you become that divided self. So there are other the heartstrings that pull and hold you. And Pam knows, even my partner in the days of this period, the last hug was always, are you trying to hold me from going, or are you really wishing me well? Because every going is a departure with an unknown destiny, and some part of me is more divided now. The responsible self is divided to history, but not the one that I'm maybe the most important to contributing to now.
Okay, but relative to that, I wanted you to talk a little bit about your work with Magnum Foundation, and also mentoring another generation of photographers. Because I think that's another aspect in which you're also maybe giving something away. It's like, being part of the conversation, hosting, mentoring. Can you talk about that as part of?
I mean, Kristen Lubbin's here, who's happily leading. Emma Raines is here in the front row, who's worked with me for almost 10 years, and Amy Yenkin is here, who made it possible for us from the Open Society, launching our seed support, which is all part of it. I think it was a 10-year, unimagined 10 years, in the sense that I didn't really know what it meant to do it. It's not like, you're given 35 years to the graduate school. By the way.
Not that long, but
okay,
yeah, but
25, 30,
yeah.
a lot. So what does it mean to, I think for me, part of maybe the deep motivation is trying to help create a community that at times I didn't have, honestly. And
around your own work.
My own understanding of my practice. I always felt outside of whatever I was in the midst of.
Well, it's because you also have never really, a lot of you know Susan's work, so well, but it's like you haven't ever fit easily any category.
Well, or I slip in and out of them.
Or you hold multiple categories.
This goes back to the delight of or the terror of being boxed in and fixed, and setting your own boundaries to challenge, and I think that's what you're doing with the mouth camera. Who's ever imagined that? Walker Evans, eat your heart out, for all of you who know his secret lens on the subway. He would never have dared to do that. So, breaking or moving
just
yourself.
Shifting one thing a little bit, it's amazing then how all the relationships around something can shift, right? And yeah.
I think both boundaries are complicated because you need them. You talked about responding to architecture.
I need that.
I think I do find. I think Carnival Strippers was very much about an architecture. The girl show was a defined space. The outside, the inside, the backstage, the whole working process through that was sculpted. The time, I think, boundaries are important to know where you are.
So in some ways, it's then the way that, as you find form, it's. Obviously, framing is a huge issue, but it's that it's always about what boundary does this need to be perceived, right, or to be recognized?
Yeah. So some of the boundaries that, going back to the Magnum Foundation, we felt that there were real boundaries, and we're all living in a time where there are way more voices that are there to be heard. So creating the opportunities for that kind of diversity, and I don't mean just, race and religion and, but geographies of the style of an expression, the place from which the work comes. There's so much more to create the conditions to release and to be experienced. And I think if we've done anything, we've tried to
amplify
and find the partners to
do that,
to celebrate beyond what we've known. And I think, you know,
And
we
to
do
invite
that
it in. Yeah.
to try and create the possibility for it, which, you know, I think it's just completely different set of conditions than my time.
And when you started, yeah.
Yeah, but eroded, progressively eroded. So the support to do a project, to go, you know, in some ways there are more platforms for work to be visible, but not the production support to sustain the work, to
Right, or to sustain something that has to happen over a really long period of time, or
Exactly.
that has to provide for you staying.
yeah,
Right, yeah.
or returning, or
Yeah.
not knowing what you're doing. I mean, there's not, again,
But,
you know,
but so part of my understanding is that then part of the work of the foundation is to try to make that condition
as much
for-
of that condition and also a
Right.
network, I think, you know,
For-
the idea that there's a
into-
network of people who
Yeah.
can find their own ways of supporting each other in a counter culture also that isn't market driven,
Right.
right? That isn't a predictable publication
Right.
environment that has to find its own expression, not just the frame, but, you know,
Yeah.
the space it belongs.
Yeah, and it's why, you know, like we're sitting in a library, you know, and it's like why our public institutions and investing in and supporting are so important. It's a question of the civic, right? And that we're here in this building, you know, we're not somewhere else now having this conversation. Yeah. Thank you for what you do.
Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, this is a question for Susan. I'm Mark Cook. We last saw each other, I guess, in Esteli back in like probably '86 or something like that. But my question is quickly, you may have covered this a little bit because I was in the back. I didn't quite hear some of the things. You've usually been covering insurrections.
I was usually covering insurrection.
Yeah, and when you do, you obviously have, you know, aware that the people you photograph, or not even photograph, the people that you meet, the people you get followed from the airport by government security forces who've been trained by guess who, and they're very sophisticated. You must, you know, you're aware of the fact all the time, as I've been aware, that you may be putting people's lives in danger simply by meeting them. And how do you deal with that, and how do they deal with it?
Well, I'm still a little thrown by your first statement that I'm usually you know, I mean, usual insurrections. I mean, insurrections aren't so usual for me, but there happens to be one right now in Nicaragua, obviously, you know, an important one. Yeah. Whether, to what extent you're putting other people at risk, or you're taking risks and putting other people at risk. I mean, all of that. How can I speak in an abstract way about that? I think about that all the time in some fashion, but I can't be. How can I tell you how I do that? I mean. I could make it seem light and tell you that sometimes the reason my hair was this long was so that I could wrap it into different formations and not be recognizable. But now, with the kind of, you know, the I.O. or whatever it's called, the intelligence services would note my eyeballs and recognize facial recognition wouldn't protect me. So there's one thing protecting yourself. Something else is how other people understand what you make and how what you make might implicate them, right? So that's another aspect of it. What's very hard in the representation of a street scene like the ones we've just seen is that you don't know where that work is going to go in this viral environment, right? You can't protect the person that you make a photograph of in the representation, in that moment of the representation, if you make that image. There are images I've made that don't reveal identity to protect the identity of someone under certain kind of conditions. But if someone's in the street they're taking that, they're making an action. And so I guess the question becomes, I can't protect them either literally in terms of the choice they've made to act. I don't think my image protects them. The question is, would that image further endanger them? And in some situations, we can all think about, and we can name a whole host of places. I mean, we know that happened in Iran. We know that that's, you know, each situation is highly specific. So I don't think you can just generalize about it. You have to function with the consciousness of it when you do or when you don't make images. When people think they understand the image you're making, they may not understand where the image you make is going to live. And I mean that, you know, in all that we were just talking about, multi-platforms, how can Beretta, the man I was talking about, the Molotov Man, fully understand how he's being seen in a completely different cultural context? So that little exhibition I showed you of the life of an image, which is an abstract idea, was living at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, a place he would never imagine being himself. So it's complicated. Does he know he's there? He knows he's there, but he's not there with experiencing that image in that context. So I don't know if I'm exposing him or I'm amplifying the possibility of his gesture being understood. I don't think it's just people spying. I think it's more complicated than the spying. Do you see what I'm saying?
Hi. I think your conversation was full of gifts for all of us, and you spoke a lot about the gift that you both wish to transmit through your various ways you're engaging with the world. And it made me think very much about, I guess, the way that there is often a divide in culture today of what is artist agency in the world, and which approach, therefore, do artists take in regard to approaching the world? Is it a more documentary kind of, more direct kind of sociological response, which seems to be perhaps your one aspect of your response, Susan, or would it be a more imaginative, maybe even physiological type of response, which seems to be the space that you occupy, Anne? And so that's why I guess the dialogue between you was so fertile for me, because it felt that that community that you speak about is somehow joined through the notion of empathy, which you mentioned at some stage in terms of how do we connect with people through empathy, which kept to be a turning, I guess, like a key preoccupation for both of you. And as somebody who likes to bring artists together, it felt that relationship, the dialogue you had, was very much, I guess, an embodiment or a representation that it is through these different fertile dialogues that we can appreciate art as being in the world. And there's not one response that's better, or the political, because in today's discourse, like the political is so, it seems to be so prevalent. But I think that, yeah, it's through going to see and reading and seeing both of your imaginations and minds and bodies come to the fore tonight that I was able to sense what makes meaning. So that's a long prelude, but I also wanted to give you this small gift, which is a it's a gift.
We're ready.
It's this very small gift. It's a poem by Edgar that he wrote in 2007, which I read yesterday and feels relevant. It says, I want to be air or wind, to be at ease in outer space, but in the world. So it made me think of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful.
Well, that's, I think...
Yeah, one more. Yeah.
This is for Anne. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the amazing construction you made in the theater in China, where you turned it into a giant loom. You talk about spaces, communing with the space and figuring out what the space means. How did this space end up with that result?
So I worked in a restored, small, historic opera theater in Wuzhen, and it was a group exhibition. I was invited to come to visit, to make a project. And one of the things that when I was visiting is they had a traditional jacquard loom studio and the traditional reeling of the silkworm, which is like the most fascinating, amazing thing that, every piece of silk that we wear is like the sacrifice of an animal. And, I was in heaven. I asked, it wasn't in production, so it only has one season where there are pieces in production. So I asked if I could use it as a space. And it was, in this context, what we did was every chair, just to describe for other people, every chair had spools of thread that then went across the space through a reed that structured them into a horizon line and onto a loom. And there was a woman weaving on stage. And we opened the back of the stage so there was light that came through. So it was really important for me to put a woman weaving on the stage in the middle of the context of this history. And so it's a long story how it actually happened, but everybody said yes every step of the way. Yeah, and the women that I met that worked on the project and were the weavers, they had the most amazing hands. Their hands were like so smart and so fast. And I was like this illiterate, sort of couldn't do anything. And yet they did not read. So it was this for me, a very meaningful exchange. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
So I want to thank you so much. I don't know that I really have a question, but I have a preoccupation. And it's this idea that we might lose a sense of feeling, that there may come a moment when we no longer fall in love. And it's literally falling in love, the act of possibly the thing we aspire to most makes us most vulnerable. And I'm wondering, in some way, this feeling of loss, that you might wake up one morning and no longer have it in you to feel, to have tactile feeling for something. How do you regain this need and desire? Because without that, you can't really create.
But don't you think, Paul, that's what the experience of art allows us to do, is to feel something? I mean, that's why we go to the opera or go to the library or go...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that's the hopeful place.
I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
That's the hopeful place. and if I think about the fearful place, it is the fear of the loss of the feeling and the inability to allow myself to be vulnerable enough to feel, and to and that unknown, and face the unknown, to want the familiar, to want the secure, to want anything that has almost a certain kind of stability to it. So it's the desire is to always be somewhat willing to be afraid of the loss of the feeling, that to motivate myself to somehow shift the ground, to seek it. And so maybe that's part of why the travel becomes the place that I can escape into feeling, because I'm in my body it's only my body moving somewhere, so I have to be committed to that, you know, in a way that we can live our lives drifting and doing and performing ourselves in the ways we're needed, and we are vital too, but that can dull the senses that are the raw place from which the really, you know, you want to go, where you want to really live. That, you know, the terror of the unknown of that, because it's, you know, you may not find it again. It's always that place that you know is the authentic place, which really came from a real place. It's not a repetition of something. Which is why I'm sorry to the guest who said, but, you know, I don't usually cover insurrections. It was the first time. I didn't expect it, and I don't think anyone else did either, but, you know, being able to respond and to stay and to go back and to trust, but maybe not again ever in the same way. So
right, because it's always going to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think, Paul, for me, it's like I think about, you know, I read the paper every morning, and there's a lot to respond to. But I also know that right now, I'm very aware that every time I go in the morning, I go to my gas stove and I turn the dial, and instantly I have a flame, and I can boil my water, and I can have my tea like within a few minutes. And I'm always right now, I'm so conscious that that's a day's work for somebody else, and that people are in a place where they have no home, and that it's such a massive thing. And I think I'm, you know, like I consciously think about that, and then I think, like, I don't know how that comes forward or in what way it comes forward into my actual making, but I know I need to feel that, and
to believe that you're creating work that's connecting people to the world that they may not inhabit, which is because they're never going to be those people. I mean,
but again, I think it's partly like, so how do we also, not just for ourselves, but for everyone, how do we cultivate like our empathetic response, the ability to feel what someone else is experiencing that is not the thing we're experiencing? And, you know, that's the work that you have done.
But you don't, it's not done, it's never done.
Or you're
because
doing.
It's always changing. I mean, when you talk about, I mean, yes, in a crude sense, the privilege of our lives, all of us being in this room, and those who probably are watching even, you know, have a privilege that's of knowing we can be here. And
you know,
I think that becomes, that is the existential
condition.
I don't know how everybody else felt this evening, but I thought it was miraculous. So I really want to thank Susan and Anne for really having a true conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carl.